Before we descend into one of the most disturbing cases documented in Louisiana's plantation records, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Track how far these buried stories travel and when people choose to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Your comment helps us understand the reach of truth that was deliberately hidden for over a century and a half at the spring auction of 1854. At the St. Charles Exchange in New Orleans was unlike any that veteran buyers could recall. There that morning hung thick with humidity and anticipation as Louisiana's wealthiest planters gathered beneath the rotunda, their pressed linen suits already dampening in the oppressive heat. But it wasn't the weather that made this auction memorable. It was Lot 29. She was brought onto the platform at precisely 10:47 in the morning. The notary would later record this exact time in his official ledger along with an unusual notation that survivors of the incident would spend decades trying to understand. The moment she stepped into the light streaming through the exchange's tall windows, every conversation in that crowded hall. Her name, according to the bill of sale, was Deline. Age estimated at 22, height 5'7" and 7 inches. Unusually tall for a woman of that era, but it was her appearance that caused the assembled crowd to fall into an unsettled silence. She possessed a beauty so striking that it seemed almost unnatural. High cheekbones, skin described in contemporary accounts as the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that one witness would later describe as dark as the bottom of a well, and just as deep. But there was something else. Something that made seasoned slave traders shift uncomfortably and caused more than one planter's wife to clutch her husband's arm with sudden anxiety. The auctioneer, a man named Claude Fourier, who had conducted thousands of such sales over his 30-year career, seemed unusually nervous as he began his presentation. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the Providence papers. "Gentlemen, we present Lot 29, female, approximately 22 years of age, trained in domestic service, needlework, and kitchen duties. Previous ownership documented through 3 separate estates." Fourier paused, clearing his throat. "Bidding will commence at $400. The silence that followed was profound. In an era when a strong field hand might sell for $800 to $1,000 and an attractive, skilled house servant could command $1,200 or more, $400 was an insult, a price suggesting damaged. No hands rose. No paddles lifted. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Fourier's voice took on a slightly desperate edge. "Surely, gentlemen, you can see the obvious value before you. $300, then. Do I hear 300? Still nothing." Men who had been eagerly bidding on previous lots now found intense interest in their boots. The ceiling, anywhere but the platform where Deline stood with her hands clasped before her, her expression serene, almost knowing. It was then that James Laveau entered the exchange. Laveau was not Louisiana aristocracy, though he aspired to be the son of a successful merchant who had made his fortune in cotton trading. James had purchased Bellamont Plantation 3 years earlier, a sprawling estate 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. At 38, he was determined to transform his new money into old respectability through the acquisition of all the proper trappings. Fine horses, imported furniture, and he had decided a collection of house servants whose appearance would announce his refined taste to visitors. He had arrived late to the auction, delayed by business at the port. As he pushed through the crowd toward the front, he caught his first glimpse of Deline on the platform. The effect was immediate and visceral. Later, in the testimony that would become part of the official inquiry, he would describe it as a physical blow, as though someone had struck me in the chest, driving all breath from my body. 200 Fourier was now pleading with the crowd. "This is robbery, gentlemen. Someone must recognize the extraordinary nature of $1,000. James Lavo's voice rang out clear and strong. The entire exchange seemed to inhale as one. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Fourier's expression shifted from relief to something approaching alarm. "Sir, the bidding currently stands at 200. I am aware." Lavo cut him off, his eyes never leaving the line. $1,000 American gold. Before could respond, an elderly man near the front of the crowd stood abruptly. His name was Ishan Devo, and he had been one of Louisiana's most successful planters for over 40 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of age and experience. "Miss Lavo, I must advise you to reconsider. There are circumstances surrounding this particular acquisition that warrant extreme caution." Turned to face him, his jaw set with the stubbornness of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "There are defects or medical conditions. They should be disclosed in the sale documents. I see no such notations." "The defects," Devo said slowly, "are not of a nature that appear in official documents." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd, but it died quickly. The old planter's expression remained grave. "3 men have owned that woman," he continued. 3 men of considerable wealth and standing in this community. All 3 are now dead. War Merrier died in his bed with no mark upon him. Yet the doctor who examined the body swore his expression was one of absolute terror. Philippe Rousseau was found in his library with a pistol in his hand and a bullet through his brain, though he left no note and had shown no signs of despair. And just last month, Antoine Beauregard walked into the Mississippi River at midnight, fully clothed, his pockets weighted with stones. The crowd had fallen completely silent now. Even the slaves waiting in the holding areas seemed to sense something in the air. "Knew all 3 men," Devo went on. "I broke bread at their tables. And I can tell you that each one in the weeks before his death underwent a change. They became withdrawn, agitated, spoke of dreams that gave them no rest, and they all mentioned her." He gestured toward Deline, who stood motionless on the platform, her face betraying no reaction to the accusations being laid out. "Whatever that woman is, Mr. Lavo, she is not merely a slave. She is a judgment waiting to be delivered." James Lavo laughed, though the sound rang hollow in the tense space. "You're asking me to believe in ghost stories and plantation superstitions. I'm a businessman, Monsieur Devo, not a child frightened by tales told in the dark." "Then you are a fool," the old man said simply and sat down. But James's pride had been engaged now. To back down would be to appear weak before the assembled elite of Louisiana society. He turned back to the auctioneer. $1,000 stands, unless someone wishes to bid higher." No one did. The silence was absolute. "Very well," Fourier said, though his voice lacked any triumph. "Sold to Mr. James Lavo for $1,000. May God have mercy on," he caught himself. "The paperwork will be prepared immediately." As James moved forward to complete the transaction, he passed close to where Deline stood. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Later, he would tell his house manager that in that moment he felt something shift inside him, as though a door he didn't know existed had been opened in his mind. But in that moment, flushed with the satisfaction of his purchase, he merely smiled and nodded to her before proceeding to Fourier's desk. The notary who prepared the bill of sale was a meticulous man named Baptiste Cayoalier. His records, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, show unusual attention to detail in this particular transaction. Alongside the standard information, he added a marginal note in his careful script. Buyer was warned by Devo and others present. Proceeded despite unanimous counsel to decline purchase. This notation made for the record should future inquiry become necessary. The journey to Belmont Plantation was conducted in James Leavo's finest carriage. He rode inside. DeLine sat beside the driver on the exterior bench. The 40 miles journey took most of the afternoon, the spring landscape rolling past in a blur of green cane fields and moss-draped oaks. During the trip, the driver, an older slave named Moses, had served the Leavo family for 20 years, later reported that he attempted conversation with the new arrival. Answered his questions politely but briefly. Yes, she could read and write. Yes, she had experience managing a large household. No, she did not know why her previous masters had met such unfortunate ends. But when I asked her that last question, Moses would later tell the investigators, she looked at me with those deep eyes of hers and said, "Something I ain't never forgotten." She said, "Sometimes, Moses, the universe keeps its own accounts, and some debts can only be settled in full." Then she smiled, but it wasn't a smile that brought any comfort. It was the smile of someone who knows a secret that would break your heart if you learned it. Belmont Plantation appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent toward the western Trian. The main house was an impressive structure built in the Greek Revival style that had become fashionable among Louisiana's planter class. White columns rose 2 stories supporting a broad ver that wrapped around the entire building. The interior rooms numbered 23, staffed by a household of 12 slaves who maintained the elaborate fiction of Gentile Southern living. James Leavo's wife, Marguerite, was waiting on the veranda when the carriage arrived. She was a thin woman of 35, the daughter of a respected but declining Creole family, who had married James for his money while he had married her for her name. The arrangement was understood by both parties and had produced 3 years of cold civility rather than anything resembling affection. As DeLine descended from the carriage, Margaret's expression shifted from bored curiosity to something approaching alarm. Moved to the veranda railing, gripping it with both hands. "James," she called out, her voice tight. "What have you done?" He looked up at her, annoyed at her tone. "I've acquired an excellent house servant at a remarkable price. Delphine will serve as your personal maid and assist in managing the household staff. I do not want her in this house." Margaret's voice had risen slightly, losing its usual controlled modulation. "Send her to the quarters. Have her work in the fields, but do not bring her into my home." James's face darkened with anger. It was one thing for his wife to maintain her icy distance in private, but to challenge his authority in front of the slaves was unacceptable. "You will mind your tongue, madam. I am master of this house and I decide where my property is assigned." He turned to DeLine, who had stood silently throughout the exchange, her expression neutral. "You will be shown to the room off the kitchen. Report to Celeste, house manager, who will explain your duties." "Yes, master," DeLine said softly, her voice like honey poured over velvet. That night, as recorded in the diary of Celeste, a 50-year-old woman who had managed the Belmont household for over a decade, the introduction of DeLine into the domestic staff created immediate disruption. Celeste's diary, discovered in an attic trunk during the 1932 demolition of what remained of Belmont, provides one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of what followed. May 15, 1854. "The master has brought a new girl into the house. Her name is DeLine, and from the moment she stepped through the kitchen door, I felt a cold wind blow through my soul despite the warm evening. The other servants feel it too. Marie crossed herself when Delphine passed her in the hallway. Young Thomas dropped a tray of dishes and fled to the quarters, saying he couldn't bear to be in the same room with her. When I asked him why, he just shook his head and said, "She ain't right, Miss Celeste. There's something behind her eyes that ain't human." I tried to dismiss such talk as superstition, but I cannot deny what I myself observed. When Deline entered the kitchen, all the candles flickered at once, though there was no draught. The pot of stew I had simmering on the stove began to boil over violently, though it had been cooking at a steady temperature for hours. And when she looked at me with those bottomless eyes, I felt as though she could see every secret sin I'd ever committed, every cruel thought I'd ever harbored. Delphine's assigned duties were simple: attend to Madame Laveau's personal needs, maintain her wardrobe, and assist with correspondence and social arrangements. On the surface, she performed these tasks with flawless efficiency. Margaret's clothing was always immaculately pressed. Her hair was arranged in the latest fashions. Her rooms were kept spotless, but within a week, Marguerite began to show signs of severe distress. She stopped eating regular meals, complaining that food had lost its taste. She suffered from nightmares that left her screaming in the darkness, though she could never remember what she had dreamed. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes. Her hands developed a tremor that no amount of laudanum could calm. On the evening of May 22nd, exactly 1 week after Deline's arrival, Marguerite confronted her husband in his study. According to testimony later provided by Moses, who was serving drinks that evening and overheard the conversation, Marguerite was nearly hysterical. She watches me, James, constantly. Even when I cannot see her, I can feel her eyes on me, and when she touches me, when she brushes my hair or fastens my dress, her fingers are ice cold and I feel something draining from me, like she's pulling the life out through my skin. "You're being ridiculous, James," replied, though Moses noted that his voice lacked conviction. "She's a servant doing her assigned tasks." "You're unwell, I'll send for Dr. Beauchamp." "No doctor can help with this," Marguerite hissed. "That woman is not what she appears. I see things in the mirror when she stands behind me. Shadows that move wrong, faces that aren't hers reflected where hers should be. Last night, I woke to find her standing over my bed, just watching me. In the darkness. When I cried out, she simply smiled and said, 'I was checking to ensure you were resting comfortably, madam.' But her eyes, God help me, James. Her eyes were glowing. Enough." James slammed his hand on the desk. "I will not tolerate this hysteria. You will compose yourself or I'll have you confined to your rooms until you regain your senses." Marguerite stared at her husband for a long moment, and Moses later said that her expression shifted from fear to something like pity. "She has you already, doesn't she? Can see it in your face. The way your eyes linger on her. The way you find excuses to be in whatever room she's working in. You think you're developing an infatuation, but it's not desire, James. It's a hook being set, and you're too arrogant to realize you're already caught." She turned and left the study. 3 days later, Marguerite Laveau was found at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken. The coroner ruled it an accidental fall, but Celeste's diary tells a different story. May 25, 1854. "Madam is dead. They say she fell, but I know better. I was in the hallway when it happened. I saw Madam standing at the top of the stairs, and I saw Deline standing beside her. They were speaking in low voices. Then Madam screamed, not a scream of fear, but of realization, as though some terrible truth had just been revealed to her. She stepped backward, toward the stairs, and I swear on my mother's grave that I saw Delphine make the slightest gesture with her hand. Just a small movement of her fingers, and Madame went over backward like she'd been pushed by an invisible force. I ran to help her, but she was already dead when I reached her, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Or maybe it's something only she could see in those final seconds. Deline came down the stairs slowly, her face showing appropriate concern, but when she passed me, she leaned close and whispered, "One account settled. The balance shifts." I don't know what she meant, but I know. I will never forget those words. The funeral was conducted with all the appropriate ceremony 3 days later. Lavo played the role of grieving husband convincingly, though several attendees noted that his grief seemed more performative than genuine. What they did notice, and what caused considerable whispered speculation, was the way his eyes kept drifting to Delphine, who stood among the house servants at the back of the gathering. "He looked at her," wrote Father Benedict Rousseau, the priest who conducted the service, in a letter to his bishop, "the way a drowning man looks. At the surface of the water he can no longer reach." With desperate longing mixed with the growing certainty of inevitable fate, in the weeks following Marguerite's death, changes at Belle-Lamont Plantation became increasingly apparent to everyone who lived or worked there. James Lavo, previously a harsh but consistent master, became erratic and unpredictable. Some days he was seized with manic energy, riding his property for hours, shouting orders, demanding impossible standards from his field hands. Other days he would barely leave his study, sitting in the darkness for hours, his meals untouched outside his door. But one constant remained: his attention to Deline. She had now been elevated from lady's maid to the unofficial mistress of the household. She gave orders to the other servants with James's full authority. She made decisions about menus, schedules, and household expenditures, and increasingly she was seen entering James' study in the evening and not emerging until dawn. The other slaves watched these developments with growing dread. In the quarters at night, away from the main, they spoke in hushed voices about what was happening to their master. "He's being ridden," said old Ruth, a woman who claimed her grandmother had been a powerful conjure woman in Haiti. "That's what we called it in the old country. They're spirits that attach themselves to the living, feeding on them slow, using them up like candles. Once they get their hooks deep enough, there ain't no way to pull free. You just burn until there's nothing left but smoke and memory." Celeste's diary entries from this period become increasingly disturbed and disjointed, reflecting her deteriorating mental state as she witnessed the transformation of Belle-Lamont. June 12, 1854. "Cannot sleep. When I close my eyes, I see her face. She is consuming this place like rot-consuming wood. The master is a shell now. I watched him at dinner tonight. He barely ate, just stared at nothing with eyes that seemed to see things the rest of us cannot. After dinner, I saw him follow Deline up the stairs like a dog following its master. There is no other word for it. He has become her creature entirely. The other servants are leaving. 2 field hands ran last week. Marie packed her things and fled in the night 3 days ago. I know I should go too, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's loyalty to the family I've served for 10 years. Or maybe it's the terrible fascination of watching something unfold that I know will end in darkness. I feel like a witness to something important, something that needs to be recorded, even if I don't survive to see anyone read these words. On June 18, 1854, James Lavo made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He appeared before a notary in New Orleans and signed papers granting Delphine her freedom. According to Louisiana law at the time, a slaveholder could manomite slave under certain circumstances, though it required extensive paperwork and justification. The notary, the same. Baptist Shiawalier, who had recorded the original sale just 5 weeks earlier, noted his concerns in the margin of the manumission papers. Mr. Lavo appeared in deteriorated condition, weight loss. The parent, hands trembling, eyes unfocused. When I questioned whether he was certain of his decision, responded, "She was never mine to own. I see that now. Some debts transcend property laws." He signed with a shaking hand and departed quickly, as though fleeing from something only he could perceive. But Freedom Papers did not mean Delphine left Belem. If anything, her presence became more dominant, more oppressive to those who remained. She now occupied Margaret's former rooms. She wore dresses from Margaret's wardrobe. She sat at Margaret's place at the dinner table across from James, the two of them eating in silence while Celeste and the remaining servants watched with growing horror. June 30th, 1854, Celeste wrote, "She is the mistress now in every way that matters. The master does whatever she asks without question. Yesterday she told him to dismiss the overseer, a brutal man named Garrett, who has terrorized the field hands for years. The master did it immediately, giving Garrett 1 hour to gather his things and leave the property. When Garrett protested, threatening to report this irregular behavior to the authorities, the master just stared at him with those empty eyes and said, 'You will leave now or you will never leave at all.' Something in his voice made Garrett go pale. He left without another word. Later, I saw Deline standing on the ver watching Garrett right away. Was smiling. Not a pleasant smile, a smile of satisfaction, like someone checking items off a long list. Her murmur something I couldn't quite make out, but it sounded like 5 names left. The reckoning continues. It was around this time that people in the surrounding community began to notice that something was wrong at Belmont. Deliveries that were once received with polite efficiency were now met with hollow-eyed servants who accepted goods without conversation and hurried back inside. Social calls went unanswered. Letters requesting James's presence at various business meetings were ignored. On July 4th, Independence Day, the entire district traditionally gathered for a celebration at the Devo Plantation. James Lavo did not attend. When Ishandeo, the same man who had warned James at the auction, rode to Belmont to check on his neighbor, he was met at the gate by Moses. "You best not come up to the Mr. Devo," Moses said, his voice low and urgent. "Things ain't right. Their master ain't himself. And that woman, she's something else. Something wrong." But Devo insisted, and Moses reluctantly led him to the main house. What the old planter found there disturbed him profoundly enough that he wrote a detailed account to his attorney, instructing it to be kept sealed unless he met with an untimely. The house itself felt wrong, he wrote. Despite the summer heat, the interior was cold. Not cool, but truly cold, like the temperature of a grave. The windows were shuttered despite the daytime hour, leaving the rooms in a perpetual twilight. I found James in his study sitting in the darkness. He barely acknowledged my presence. When I asked after his health, he said, "I am learning, Ishan. I am learning what I should have been taught long ago. That actions have consequences that echo. That debts accumulate across generations, and that justice, when it finally arrives, is absolute and cannot be bargained with." I attempted to reason with him, to remind him of his responsibilities, his position in society. He laughed at this, a bitter sound devoid of humor. Position. Society, these are illusions, comfortable lies we tell ourselves to justify the unjustifiable. I see clearly. The bill has come due. It was then that she entered the room. Deline. She moved with a grace that seemed unnatural, as though her feet barely touched the floor. She placed a hand on James's shoulder, and I swear I saw him flinch. Not in rejection but in something approaching ecstasy mixed with pain. She looked at me with those bottomless eyes and said, "Miss your Devo, how kind of you to visit. But my master requires rest now. Perhaps you should return to your own household. After all, you have much to reflect upon regarding your own accounts." The way she said accounts made my blood run cold. I left quickly, and as I rode away, I looked back once. She was standing on the verge watching me, and even from that distance, I could feel the weight of her gaze, measuring, calculating, judging. The events of late July 1854 at Belmont Plantation were documented through multiple sources that, when assembled, paint a picture of systematic, psychological, and possibly supernatural disintegration. Celeste's diary becomes increasingly fragmented during this period. Her entries sometimes consisting of single sentences written in shaking handwriting, other times sprawling across multiple pages in a cramped script that suggests she was writing in desperate haste, trying to record everything before memory or sanity failed her. July 19, 1854. The master has taken to walking the property at night. I watch from my window as he moves through the darkness, sometimes alone, sometimes with her beside him. They go to the old cemetery at the north edge of the property where the previous owners buried their slaves. I can see lantern light there for hours. What are they doing among those unmarked graves? What conversations are they having with the dead? This morning I found the master in the library. He was surrounded by papers, old bills of sale, property records, purchase documents dating back 40 years. He was copying names into a ledger, his hand moving mechanically across the page. When I asked what he was doing, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged decades overnight and said, "Making a list, Celeste. Everyone who profited from misery, everyone who built comfort on suffering. The accounting must be complete before the reckoning can proceed." I looked at the names he'd written. I recognized many of them, prominent families, respected men, some still living, others long dead. And at the top of the list, written in bolder ink than the rest, was his own name, James Pierre Lavo. On July 23rd, something occurred that would later be investigated by civil authorities. Though their official report raised more questions than it answered, a neighboring planter named Charles Whitmore arrived at Belmont, uninvited and belligerent. Whitmore was known throughout the district as a particularly cruel master, one who treated his enslaved workers with casual brutality that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of other slaveholders. According to Thomas, a young slave who witnessed the encounter from the kitchen, Whitmore pounded on the front door, demanding to speak with James. When Deline answered instead, Whitmore's face darkened with rage. "I'll speak to the master of this house, not his fancy bedwarmer," he snarled. "Tell Lavo to get out here or I'll drag him out." Deline's expression remained serene. "Sure, Whitmore. How interesting that you should come here. Master Lavo has been expecting you." "Expecting me? I've sent no word." "Not expecting in that sense," she interrupted, her voice soft, but carrying clearly in the still air. "Expecting in the sense that your name appears on a particular list, a list of accounts requiring settlement." Whitmore's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "You dare speak to me with such insolence? I should have you whipped within an inch of your life, for you should have many things, Monsieur Whitmore. You should have mercy. You should have conscience. You should have hesitated before you beat that 14-year-old girl to death last month for the crime of breaking a dish. But you didn't, and now accounts must balance. Thomas later testified that Whitmore's face went from red to white in an instant. How do you know about that? Was an accident? The girl was clumsy. She was a child named Sarah, Deline said, and now her voice carried an edge like broken glass. She had a mother named Ruth who still weeps for her. Had a younger brother who no longer speaks because the trauma of watching his sister die broke something in his. Her blood is on your hands, Monsieur Whitmore, and blood calls out for blood. It was then that James emerged from the house, but the man who appeared bore little resemblance to the vigorous planter who had purchased Delphine just 2 months earlier. He had lost perhaps 30 pounds. His skin had taken on a grayish pore. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. He moved with the shuffling gait of a man 3 times his age. But when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made Whitmore step backward. You're on my property uninvited, Charles. You should leave. Not until you explain what this woman has been saying. Spreading lies about me, making accusations. Are they lies? James asked quietly. Did you not beat young Sarah to death? Did you not throw her body into an unmarked pit like? Refuse? Did you not threaten her mother with the same fate if she spoke of it? Whitmore's hand tightened on his pistol. Grip. Those are my affairs, Level. My property to manage as I see fit. What concern is it of yours? It concerns me, James said, because I'm learning the true cost of such management. Every blow struck, every life taken, every dignity destroyed. These things do not vanish into the past, Charles. They accumulate, they compound, and eventually the bill comes due. Thomas described what happened next as something he could never adequately explain. Delphine made a small gesture with her hand, just a slight movement of her fingers, and Charles Whitmore clutched his chest, his face contorting in agony. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, his pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. What are you doing to me? He choked out. I am doing nothing, Delphine replied calmly. Your own heart is rebelling against you. The organ that should have contained compassion instead held only cruelty, and now it fails under the weight of its own poison. This is not my judgment, Mr. Whitmore. Is the judgment of every life you destroyed, delivered through the mechanism of your own corrupted flesh. Whitmore collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto his face. By the time Moses and Thomas reached him, he was dead. The subsequent examination by Dr. Philippe Beauchamp concluded that Whitmore had suffered an apoplectic event, likely resulting from years of excessive drink and input behavior. But Dr. Boscombe's private notes discovered in his effects after his own death 20 years later told a different story. I have never seen such a death. The man's heart was not merely stopped. It was destroyed from within as though consumed by some internal fire. The surrounding tissue showed evidence of trauma that I can only describe as impossible. Whatever killed Charles Whitmore, it was not a natural event. And the calm certainty in the eyes of that woman, Deline, standing there watching him die, suggested she knew exactly what was happening and had perhaps orchestrated it through means I dare not name in any official document. Whitmore's body was removed. Life at Belmont continued its descent into darkness. The field hands, having witnessed Whitmore's death, now regarded Deline with a complex mixture of fear and something approaching reverence. Walked among them in the evenings, speaking to them in low voices, learning their names, their stories, the details of their suffering. She asked me about my children. One field hand named Josiah later testified, asked where they were, who owned them now. I told her they'd been sold away 5 years ago to settle Master James' gambling debts. 3 children, all under 10, sold to different buyers across 3 states. She listened to it all and then she put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Their names will be added to the accounting. All debts will be collected. All separations will be answered for." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I do now. She was gathering evidence, building a case against every man who'd profited from our misery. Master James, he was helping her. Every night they'd sit in that library, going through papers, adding names to that ledger. Sometimes Master James would weep as he wrote, but he never stopped. It was like he couldn't stop, like he'd been given a task he had to complete, even though it was destroying him. Early August, James Lavo had become a virtual prisoner in his own home. He rarely left his study. His meals were brought to him by Celeste, who reported that he barely ate. The room itself had transformed into something between an archive and a shrine. The walls were covered with papers, names, dates, transactions, maps showing the routes of slave ships, detailed genealogies tracing the fates of families torn apart by sale, and in the center of it all, the large leather ledger that James filled with methodical precision. Page after page of names and sins and accumulated. Celeste's entry from August 7th provides crucial insight into what was happening. I don't think the master is entirely himself anymore. Or rather, I think he is more than himself. When he looks at me, I see something in his eyes that was never there before. An awareness that seems to come from outside him. When he speaks, the words are his, but the knowledge behind them is ancient and terrible. "Today," he said to me, "do you know how many lives my family destroyed to build this plantation, Celeste?" I did not. Truly, until she showed me. My father, my grandfather, generations of Lavos. Purchasing human beings, working them to death, replacing them with new purchases. An endless cycle of suffering that generated our comfort, our wealth, our position in society. I counted them last night. 743 names in the ledgers. 743 people who passed through Lavo. Ownership, most dying before age 40 from overwork, malnutrition, punishment, despair. And those are just the ones recorded. How many more are there? How many children born here and sold away before they could be listed in the inventory? How many deaths attributed to natural causes that were really murder through negligence or deliberate cruelty? The true accounting is beyond calculation, but she knows. She remembers all of them. She carries their names, their stories, their unfinished business. Now through me, that business will be completed. Celeste attempted to send word to Dr. for Beauchamp hoping he might be able to help James. But when the doctor arrived on August 10th, Deline met him at the door. "The master is not receiving visitors," she said simply. "I'm his physician. I must insist." "You are also," she interrupted, consulting a small notebook she pulled from her pocket. "The owner of 6 slaves, 3 of whom you purchased from the estate of Antoine Beauregard, including a young woman named Marie, who you purchased specifically for personal purposes that no physician should engage in with those under his power. Would you like me to continue reading from this account, doctor, or would you prefer to leave now and reflect upon your own impending reckoning?" Dr. Champ left without another word. He would hang himself in his study 6 weeks later, leaving a note that read only, "The inventory of my sins exceeds my capacity for living with them." By mid-August, the transformation at Belma had reached its culmination. The field hands no longer worked under compulsion. There was no overseer, no whip, no threat of punishment. Yet, they worked harder than ever, not for James Lavo's benefit, but for Deline's purpose. Under her direction, they planted specific crops in particular patterns. They harvested plants from the surrounding swamplands and brought them to her. They dug in certain locations according to her precise instructions, unearthing objects that had been buried long ago, small bundles of cloth containing bones, hair, dried herbs, items that those who knew recognized as the buried power of conjure work from decades past. Just gathering it all. Old Ruth explained to the others one evening. All the old knowledge, all the hidden power that our grandparents brought from Africa and buried in this soil to keep it safe from the masters. She knows where it all is. She can feel it calling to her, and she's using it to build something. Something that's going to shake this entire region to its foundations. On August 18th, James Lavo emerged from his study for the first time in over a week. He gathered the remaining servants and field hands in front of the main house. Those who were present described a man so physically diminished he could barely stand, yet possessed of an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I have completed the accounting," he announced, his voice but clear. "Every name, every transaction, every life destroyed or damaged by the actions of my family and those like us. The ledger is complete. Tomorrow, the reckoning begins." He turned to Delphine, who stood beside him on the veranda. "I understand now why you chose me. Not because I was the worst, or far worse, but because I was the one who could be awakened, the one who retained enough conscience, buried deep. Enough that when confronted with the full truth of what my comfort cost, I could not turn away. I am the instrument of my own judgment. Is that correct?" Deline's expression was unreadable. "You are beginning to understand, but the judgment is not yours alone. You are one note in a symphony of justice that has been building for 2 centuries. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the veil is thinnest, the symphony will play its first full measure." The night fires could be seen burning at various points around the Belmont property. Not destructive fires, but controlled blazes at precise locations. The smoke that rose from them carried a smell that those who remembered the old ways recognized. It was the smell of summoning, of calling across the barrier between the living and the dead. And in the main house, James Lavo sat in his study, making the final entries in his ledger. Celeste, watching from the doorway, saw him write his own name at the bottom of the final page. Then, with a steady hand, he signed his full name beneath it, like a man signing a confession. "If you've made it this far into this account, I want to pause and ask something of you. This channel, the sealed room, exists to bring you these buried stories, the histories that were deliberately hidden, the truths that make people uncomfortable. This investigation into America's darkest corners speaks to you. If you believe these stories need to be told, take a moment right now to subscribe and turn on notifications. These aren't just ghost stories. They're accountings of real injustice, real suffering, and sometimes real consequences. Help us make sure they reach the people who need to hear them." Now, let's return to Belmont Plantation in the night of August 19, 1854. The night when 2 centuries have accumulated, debt came due in ways that witnesses would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. The night of August 19, 1854 began with an oppressive stillness that unnerved even those who had lived their entire lives in Louisiana's humid climate. The air felt thick, almost solid, making each breath an effort. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs refused to bark. Horses stood trembling in their stalls, and birds that should have been roosting instead circled overhead in agitated patterns, silhouetted against the moonless sky. Celeste's final diary entry, written in the early hours of that evening, captures the atmosphere. Something is coming. Everyone feels it. The slaves have gathered in the quarters, singing old songs and languages. I don't recognize. The words sound like prayers or maybe warnings. I should leave. I should run, but I cannot. Need to witness what happens here. Someone must bear testimony to the end of this. Whatever that end might be. Precisely midnight, as later confirmed by the stopped pocket watch found in James Lavo's study, events began to unfold that would be documented through multiple sources. Though every account contains elements that seem impossible, details that make rational explanation challenging. Moses, watching from the quarters, saw lights appear in every window of the main house simultaneously. Not the warm glow of candles or lamps, but a cold blue-white luminescence that hurt to look at directly. He heard singing, though no human voices could be producing the sounds. They seemed to come from the earth itself, from the walls, from the very air. Had crept closer to observe despite his fear, reported seeing figures moving through the downstairs rooms, not the vague shapes of shadows, but distinct human forms. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, men, women, children, all moving with purpose, all converging toward James Lavo's study, where the master sat at his desk. The completed ledger opened before him. They came through the walls. Thomas later testified, his voice shaking even years after the event. They didn't open doors or windows. They just appeared, passing through solid matter like it wasn't. And their faces, Lord have mercy, their faces. Some I recognized from gerotypes I'd seen in the master's papers. People who'd been dead for decades. Others I'd never seen, but that all had the same look about them. They'd been hurt, used up, thrown away, and now they'd come back for something. Delphi stood in the center of the entrance hall as this impossible congregation assembled. Witnesses described her appearance as transformed. The beauty that had captivated James at the auction was still present, but now it seemed less human, more like the terrible perfection of a storm or a wildfire. Natural forces that care nothing for human comfort. When she spoke, her voice carried throughout the house and beyond, reaching every ear on the plantation. The accounting is complete, she announced. Every name recorded, every sin documented, every debt calculated. Now comes the collection. Turn to James, who sat motionless at his desk, staring at the ledger before him. James Pierre Lavo, you purchased me believing I was property to be owned. But I was never a slave. I am something older, something that was here before your kind. Arrived with your chains and your ledgers. I am the memory that will not fade. I am the debt that comes due. The justice that arrives when all other justice has been denied. I know, James whispered, and those close enough to see his face later said, his expression held not fear, but something approaching relief. I know what you are. I've known for weeks now. You are the reckoning our actions demanded. The balance are cruelty upset, and I am ready to pay what I owe. Delphine moved closer to him, and the assembled figures, spirits, ghosts, manifestations of the dead, whatever they were, moved with her, creating a procession that filled the house from foundation to roof beam. Payment requires more than your death, James Lavo. Death is too simple, too quick. Payment requires transformation. You will become what you once owned. You will know what you once inflicted. Every pain, every humiliation, every moment of despair that your family's wealth was built upon, you will experience it all. Not for an instant, but for as long as memory persists. And when you finally fade, your essence will join with all the others, becoming part of the collective testimony that ensures these crimes are never forgotten. Happened next was witnessed by at least a dozen people from various vantage points. And while their accounts differ in details, they agree on the essential facts. James Lavo stood from his desk. walked to the center of the room, and simply dissolved. His physical form seemed to break apart like smoke and wind, dispersing into countless fragments that were drawn into the assembled multitude of spirits. His final expression, captured in that last moment before dissolution, was described by some as agony, by others as ecstasy, and by still others as both at once. The lights throughout the house flared blindingly bright, then extinguished all at once. When vision returned to those watching, the house stood empty. No spirits, no Deline, no James Lavo. Only the ledger remained sitting open on the desk, its pages filled with names and dates and accusations written in James' increasingly deteriorating handwriting. But the events of that night were not confined to Belmont Plantation. In the days and weeks that followed, reports emerged from across Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Corollas of prominent planters and slave traders dying under mysterious circumstances or experiencing sudden, complete personality changes. Judge William Fairchild of Natchez, who had made a fortune buying and selling slaves at auction, was found in his courtroom at dawn, seated at his bench, staring at nothing. He remained in that catatonic state for 3 years, before dying without ever speaking another word. Before he fell into silence, he had scrolled a single word across his legal papers in shaking letters. Deline. Plantation owner Robert Ashford of Charleston woke one morning speaking only in Gula, the Creole language of enslaved Africans in the Carolina Low Country. He claimed to be a woman named Esther who had died on his property 20 years earlier. He proceeded to describe in precise detail every brutality he had inflicted upon her. His family had him institutionalized. He never regained his original identity. Slave trader Hamilton Cross of Richmond disappeared entirely. Last seen walking into the James River, fully clothed at midnight, his pockets filled with rocks. His account books were found on the riverbank, every page covered in writing that was not his own. Hundreds of names, presumably of people he had bought and sold, written over and over until the ink bled through multiple pages. The official investigation into the disappearance of James Lavo was cursory at best. Louisiana authorities, perhaps sensing something they preferred not to examine too closely, ruled that he had abandoned his property and departed for parts unknown. Belmont Plantation was sold at auction to settle debts, but no buyer could be found willing to actually occupy the main house. The enslaved population of Belmont was dispersed to other properties, but those who had been present on the night of August 19th carried with them stories that spread through the underground network of slave communities throughout the South. Stories of justice that came from beyond the grave, of debts that could not be escaped, of a beautiful woman with bottomless eyes who appeared when the accounting of cruelty grew too heavy for the universe to bear. Celeste survived the events at Belmont and eventually gained her freedom during the chaos of the Civil War. She carried her diary with her, adding entries occasionally, until her death in 1891. Her final entry, written just days before she passed, provides crucial testimony. I have lived a long life since that terrible night. I have seen slavery end. I have seen the South burn and rebuild. I have seen laws change and society transform. But I have never forgotten what I witnessed. The world likes to pretend that injustice fades with time, that the sins of the past can be buried and forgotten. But I know better. I saw the proof. Some debts transcend death. Some injustices create echoes that never stop reverberating. And somewhere, in ways we cannot fully understand, accounts are being kept, balances being restored. Justice, delayed but never denied, continues its work. The main house at Belmont stood empty for 37 years. Multiple attempts were made to renovate or repurpose the structure, but workers consistently reported disturbing phenomena. Sounds of weeping coming from empty rooms, the smell of tobacco smoke, though no one was smoking. The sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Disturbing were the sightings of a tall, beautiful woman walking the halls at dusk, her footsteps making no sound, her dark eyes seeming to look through the living into some deeper reality. In 1891, the house burned to the ground. Under mysterious circumstances, the fire started simultaneously in multiple rooms on a night with no lightning, no candles lit, no possible natural cause. By morning, only the chimney and foundation stones remained. Local firefighters who responded to the blaze reported hearing singing as the structure burned. Hundreds of voices raised in what sounded like celebration or perhaps lamentation, though no living people were present. The land itself remained unused. For decades, it sat vacant, gradually being reclaimed by the Louisiana wilderness. Trees grew through the foundation. Vines covered the remaining stone. The fields where enslaved people had labored under brutal conditions transformed into swampland as though the earth itself was trying to erase the memory of what had occurred. But erasure proved impossible. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, accounts continued to emerge of encounters with something at the former Belle Lamont site. Hunters reported seeing a woman in antebellum dress standing among the ruins, disappearing when approached, travelers passing on the nearby road claimed their horses refused to move past certain points. And consistently, year after year, people reported finding objects that should not have been there. Small bundles of cloth containing bones and dried herbs, items that those familiar with African American folk traditions recognized as conjure work. The most significant discovery came in 1923 when a team from Towan University conducted an archaeological survey of plantation sites along the river at Belle Lamont. They uncovered something that had not appeared on any property map or record. Beneath the remains of the main house foundation, they found a large stone chamber carefully constructed from materials not native to Louisiana. Inside the chamber, they discovered hundreds of small clay vessels, each sealed with wax and marked with symbols that anthropologists later identified as coming from various West African traditions, Yoruba, Igbo, Ashanti, and others. When carefully opened, the vessels contained soil apparently collected from different locations, each sample labeled in multiple languages with what appeared to be names and this. The research team's leader, Professor Marcus Dequa, documented his findings in a report that was quickly classified as sensitive by university administrators and locked away in special collections. That report, finally made public in 1998, contained Professor Dequa's disturbing conclusion. What we have discovered appears to be a systematic collection of soil samples from grave sites, specifically the unmarked graves of enslaved Africans. Throughout the region, the dates span from 1720 to 1854. The level of organization suggests a project that would have required decades to complete and a depth of knowledge about burial locations that seems impossible for any single individual to possess. Most troubling is what we found. At the center of the chamber, a large ceramic jar sealed and marked with the named line in precise script. Inside we found not soil but what appears to be a ledger identical to the one described in historical accounts as having belonged to James Lavo. However, the entries continue beyond 1854 listing names and dates that extend to the present day. And at the very end in handwriting that matches the earlier entries, a single statement. The accounting continues. Justice is patient, but inevitable. All debts will be collected. The university sealed the chamber and quietly returned the contents. Official records state that the items were reinterred according to proper archaeological protocols, though no specific details were provided. The site was designated protected wetlands, ensuring no further development or excavation would occur. In 1967, during the height of the civil rights movement, something remarkable happened at the former Belmont site. On the night of August 19th, exactly 113 years after the events documented in this account, over 1,000 people spontaneously gathered at the location. They came without organization or announcement, drawn by what many described as an inexplicable compulsion to be present. Among those present was Sarah Beaumont, the great-great-granddaughter of Josiah, the field and who had spoken with Deline about his sold children. Sarah had become a prominent civil rights organizer, and she later described her experience in an interview preserved in the Library of Congress Oral History Collection. "I didn't know why I needed to be there that night. I just knew I did. When I arrived, there were already hundreds of people present, black and white, young and old. No one was speaking. We just stood there in the darkness. And then precisely at midnight we all heard it singing. Hundreds of voices raised in harmony, though none of us were making the sounds. It wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. It sounded like ancestors welcoming us, thanking us for remembering, for continuing the work of justice they began. And I swear on my life I saw her, a tall, beautiful black woman standing at the center of where the main house once stood. She was looking at all of us with these incredibly deep eyes. And I felt like she was taking measure of how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. Then she smiled, not a smile of satisfaction, but a smile of encouragement, and faded into the darkness like smoke dissipating. When the singing stopped, we all stood there for a moment in silence. Then someone started singing, "We Shall Overcome," and we all joined in. It felt like we were being given a blessing to continue the work. Like the spirits of those who had suffered were passing the torch to us, trusting us to keep pushing toward justice. The site has since become an unofficial place of pilgrimage. People leave flowers, light candles, plant trees. In 2004, a historical marker was installed, though the text is notably vague, mentioning only that a plantation once stood here, home to many enslaved people whose names and stories have been lost to time. But those who know the full story understand that the names were never truly lost. They were recorded, they were remembered, and in ways both mysterious and unmistakable, they continue to demand acknowledgement. The most recent documented encounter occurred in 2019. A descendant of Charles Whitmore, the planter who died after confronting Deline, visited the site as part of a personal quest to understand his family history. He had discovered his ancestors' involvement in slavery through genealogical research and felt compelled to make some form of amends. His account posted on a genealogy forum and later verified through multiple sources described standing at the site at sunset trying to formulate words adequate to express his horror at his ancestors' actions. As he stood there struggling, he became aware of a presence beside him. He turned to find a woman standing there, tall, beautiful, with dark skin and eyes that seemed infinitely deep. She didn't speak, he wrote, but somehow I understood what she was communicating. That acknowledgement was a beginning, but only a beginning. That the work of repair is never finished. That every generation must choose whether to continue cycles of harm or break them. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite forgiveness. I don't think I deserved forgiveness, but maybe it was permission to try to do better. Then she was gone and I was standing alone again. But I felt different. Lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know was there. And part of it had been lifted. Not all of it, but enough to let me move forward. To this day, the former. Belmont Plantation remains a place where the boundaries between past and present seem permeable. Visitors report unusual experiences, vivid dreams of lives they never lived, sudden emotional responses they cannot explain, and occasionally glimpses of a tall, beautiful woman who watches from the edge of perception, her dark eyes holding centuries of memory and judgment. The ledger that James Lavo compiled was never officially recovered, though rumors persist that it resurfaces periodically, always with new names, added in various handwritings, as though the accounting continues beyond any single individual's effort. Some say it appears in the hands of those who need to see it, people in positions of power who have forgotten the human cost of their decisions, who have allowed themselves to become comfortable with systems of exploitation and cruelty. Whether these stories represent supernatural events, collective psychological phenomena, or simply the power of guilt and memory, one truth remains undeniable. The events at Belmont Plantation in 1854 entered into the folklore and historical consciousness of the region in a way that transcends simple ghost stories. They became a parable about debt and payment, about the impossibility of escaping the consequences of cruelty, about justice that operates on time scales longer than individual lives. The archives of the Louisiana Historical Society. There exists a small collection of items donated anonymously in 1954, exactly 100 years after the events at Belmont. Among these items is a Juret-type photograph dated 1853 showing a group of people at what appears to be a slave auction. In the background, barely visible, is a tall woman with remarkable beauty watching the proceedings with an expression that can only be described as patient calculation. Written on the back of the photograph in handwriting that matches the entries in James Lavo's ledger is a single sentence. She was there before. She is here now. She will be there after. Memory never dies, and neither does justice. The story of Deline and James Lavo remains officially unsolved, categorized in historical records as a case of abandonment and property loss during the turbulent 1850s. But among those who study the hidden histories of the American South, among the descendants of enslaved people who carry these stories forward, and among those who visit the site where Belmont once stood, a different understanding prevails. Some accounts can never be closed. Some debts transcend mortal timelines. And somewhere, in ways that slip between the boundaries of rational explanation, the work continues. Names are recorded. Stories are preserved. And when the accumulated weight of injustice grows too heavy, when the scales tip too far toward cruelty, something ancient and patient and absolutely certain steps forward to restore the balance. Thus, person to see Delphine or someone matching her description was a historian researching plantation records in Louisiana State Archives. In 23, she was working late alone in the reading room when she became aware of another presence. A tall, beautiful black woman stood at the far end of the room, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound ledgers as though searching for something specific. When the historian looked up to ask if she needed assistance, the woman turned and their eyes met. The historian later described those eyes as containing depths that went back centuries, holding every story that was ever silenced, every name that was ever erased, every injustice that was ever forgotten by everyone except those who suffered it. The woman smiled slightly, then spoke in a voice like honey poured over stone. Keep reading. Keep writing. Keep remembering. That is the beginning of all justice. To bear witness to refuse to let the convenient lies stand. Insist that the dead are acknowledged and the living are held accountable. You do important work. Continue it. Then she was gone. The reading room was empty except for the historian who found herself crying without quite understanding why. But when she returned to her research, she found her notebook open to a page she had not written. It in unfamiliar handwriting was a list of names. Enslaved people who had lived and died at Bellamont Plantation. Their existence previously undocumented. Their stories presumed lost forever, but not lost. Never truly lost. Just waiting. For someone to listen, someone to record, someone to insist that they mattered, that their suffering was real, that the debts incurred through their exploitation remain unpaid and will continue to be presented to every generation until true justice is achieved. The accounting continues. The balance seeks restoration. And somewhere between history and legend, between the documented past and the stories, whispered in the dark, a beautiful woman with ancient eyes keeps watch, keeps records, and keeps faith that eventually, inevitably, all accounts will be settled and all stolen dignity will be restored. That is the true story of Deline, the most beautiful slave who was never really a slave at all, and the master who bought her only to discover that some things can never be owned, some debts can never be escaped, and some forms of justice are patient enough to wait for centuries, but absolute enough to never compromise, never forget, and never ever forgive without genuine transformation. The fields where enslaved people once labored under the Louisiana sun are quiet now. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the air is still, those who listen carefully can hear singing drifting across the abandoned land. Songs and languages that predate colonization, voices that refuse to be silenced. And beneath it all, like a heartbeat, the steady rhythm of accounts being kept, debts being calculated, and justice, delayed but never denied, continuing its patient, inevitable work.